Privilege to introduce our next speaker. I have come to know him and admire the many talents that he has and the service that he has given both our Lord and our country. He has been a speaker at our high school when it was functional and very inspirational to our students in an understanding of what it means to occupy a Christian citizenship where God has placed us in this world. Mr. Timothy Goeglein has served as Communications Director for 10 years for Senator Dan Coates. He was Special Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison under both administrations of the Bush tenure recently. He is now Vice President, focus on the family, also serves as a Senior Fellow of the Heritage Foundation. It's my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Timothy Goeglein.
Jack Parr once said with certain introductions you should just say thank you and good night. And with all those long titles, it proves that, at least in Washington, the longer the title, the least amount of influence. I can honestly say, without overstating it, that the most important title is follower of Jesus Christ, husband and father. And everything else is icing on the cake. I have found in 45 years on planet Earth, and as the last year of the baby boom, 1964, that the best way that I have ever invested my life is in my relationship with Jesus, with relationships with my family and with my friends. And after that, all the other things are nice. And they're not incidental, they're important. But as a fellow Lutheran Christian, and I know I'm speaking to exactly the right crowd, it's remarkable what you have in life when you walk every day in the light and the glory of Jesus Christ. I can honestly say that arriving from Athens and coming to Jerusalem today, that I am a Christian and I am a conservative, and I almost every day have people ask me, how as a Christian and conservative do you function inside the Beltway? And I say that at least on odd days of the week you feel like a vegetarian at a cattlemen's convention. It is not a place that is mostly commodious to the way that you and I see the world. There is such a thing as worldview. And I think it's fair to say that in most days of the week, that unfortunately the worldview that is promulgated from Washington is not our worldview. I can also say that along the lines of those big titles that I was labeled with, that I have had, which I say in great humility, I have had the blessings and the benefits of having worked with the princes of this world. And I understand that with all of those responsibilities and remarkable professional experiences come obligations and duties as well. It's a remarkable thing to have a U.S. Senator ask what it is you think about things, and to spend your professional life traveling the globe and speaking with the other 99 members of the most prestigious club, as it's called. That can go right to your head. And I can honestly say, again in humility, that being human, pride, is in fact the great enemy. It is also, I can honestly say, a remarkable thing to be sitting in the Oval Office and to have the leader of the free world be taking notes while you're saying anything at all. And I can honestly say that in my line of work, it was a wonderful thing, a happy, joyous thing, because my duties for George W. Bush were to be the outreach guy to all of American Christianity and conservatism, the think tanks, the public policy organizations, the larger cultural institutions. And so at least most of the time, it was very commodious with the way I know people in this room see life. Never once in 8 years was I asked to sort of subordinate my most deeply held religious and moral principles, and that's largely, I think, because I was working for a man who, if you were standing here today, would tell you that the most important relationship in his life is the one with Jesus Christ as well. I want to say one other thing before I get started, and it's this. I made a promise to myself when I came to Washington 20 years ago. And the promise I made to myself was that if it were humanly possible, I would never say no to speaking to a group of young people. And so I think by my own calculus, as of about 2 weeks ago, I have traveled a little over 400,000 miles to speak in very large forums and in very small forums to young people. And when Steve asked if I would be willing to come and speak, I had a colleague ask me, well, how many people are you speaking to this time, 1,500? And I said, no, it'll probably be the most happy, joyful group of about 70 or 80 people you can possibly imagine. And he said, now, why would you travel all of that way to speak to 70 or 80 people? And I said, you know, my friend Irving Kristol once said that if you want to have 9 million people read what it is you have to say, then go ahead and get published as the lead item in the Reader's Digest. But he said to me, Tim, if you really want to impact American culture, then you ought to get the lead item in Foreign Affairs or the New Yorker or Harper's Magazine, because it'll be a much smaller readership, but it's who's reading. And I understand that when I come to stand before a group of educators, headmasters, administrators, and teachers, and I'm not going to patronize you by saying this, but your vocation is the most important vocation in the United States of America. Because any vocation that spends his or her life shaping and molding the rising generation of young people cannot be surpassed by any other vocation. And in fact, I can just know, because I have made a point over time to write a letter to every single one of my teachers from the ages of K all the way through up to and including my graduation from Indiana University. And I said in my letters to all of my teachers that other than my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and the people who shape you as a little person particularly, that there is nobody who is more important in my life than my teachers and my headmasters and my principals. So if there's anybody in this room who has ever asked him or herself whether you chose the right vocation, whether you've had to have some financial struggle or some challenge to overcome, there's at least one person who's here standing before you to say that you chose rightly, and that whatever hurdle you've had to overcome, it's been worth all of your time. Because it's probable that passing through your school or your classroom has been a person who one day may be a member of Congress, may be a member of the Supreme Court, and who knows, maybe even someday we will have our first Missouri Synod Lutheran President of the United States of America. The fact that we should preoccupy ourselves with this rising generation of young people is a good way to spend our life. And by the way, this generation takes an enormous amount of criticism. And it almost always takes an enormous amount of criticism from people who spend no time with young people. And I think you will confirm that this generation of young people is bright and is smart and is impatient for all the right things. But I think, unfortunately, they've had to live with a lot. They've lived through a lot. And as I was flying out this morning, I had an assistant of mine prepare some of the demographic changes that sort of go to the heart of the matter, and I'd like to share some of those with you, if I may. There was a report that came out from the Department of Health about 4 weeks ago that said that America now has the highest illegitimacy rate in its history. In 1967, a man called Daniel Patrick Moynihan prepared a report for Richard Nixon. And Pat Moynihan found that over against the most recent year he had compared, which was 1952, that illegitimacy in America was about 14%. This was shocking, that more than 1 in 10 Americans was born out of wedlock. He had the duty to report to the future president that these rates were growing at 1 or 2% a year. He was castigated as a bigot. The report was ridiculed in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And as we all woke up this morning in America, 2009, we find that wedlock, births out of wedlock, is now 41% in America. And in my adopted town of Washington, D.C., our wedlock rates, and I know you're all sitting down, is 69%. That's shocking. In America today, half of all marriages end in divorce, and 75% of all second marriages end in divorce. Here's something else that's shocking. I was talking with Archbishop Worrell, Donald Worrell, who is the Catholic Archbishop of Washington. And he told me that in Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, young boys and young girls of color were increasingly spending no time in their entire lives in their own homes, living for even a single day with their natural father. And so I asked my colleagues at Focus on the Family to tell me in the major urban areas what these numbers were. And I received a call one day from our public policy division, and my colleague let me know that in the most recent number, which was 2006, that boys and girls ages 0 to 18, that a little over 75% of them would never spend one day of their life in their home with their natural father. In Washington, D.C., in the public schools, we spend a little over $17,000 per student in the public schools. We have the lowest SAT scores in the United States of America, and we have the highest dropout rates, 67%. This is the most powerful nation in world history, and Washington, or from Washington, supposedly comes the decisions governing the most powerful nation in the world. I say all these things actually not to shock. I say all these things because in 2009, we have arrived at a chapter of our American history where, depending on your politics, left or right, Democrat or Republican, all of the above, none of the above, depending on what day of the week it is or what time of the day, that at the end of the day, it just doesn't matter. Because if you're a Republican like me, or a Democrat, and I'll be the loyal opposition for purposes of today's speech, you could win the House and the Senate. You could have everybody you want on the Supreme Court. But if we lose the culture, it just doesn't matter. So to come full circle, the question is, why is it that what you're doing is so important? And if I had to put it in a word, I would say it's this: that the purpose of an education, the purpose of the liberal arts, is to form the citizen. There was a very, very influential German philosopher who taught for a little over 50 years at Dartmouth College, Eugene Rosenstock Hoshi. And he had a view which is not a theory, but which he had discerned from his time in studying ancient Greece and Rome. And he said that the purpose of an education was such that if your civilization was destroyed, that your young people would have been so well educated in the natural tendencies of the Western civilization and the Western culture, their own, that they would be able philosophically to put it all back together again. And I have to tell you that as we step off into the 21st century, I know you and I, even if we are hopefulists as Christians in our DNA, are facing a rough road. And I will make a very large statement. If we do not, as a nation, get the cultural questions right, I think it is possible that we will, in the 21st century, lose the United States Constitution. And my friends, if we lose the United States Constitution, we will never get it back. I have a very dear friend, Butch Whiteman, who has worked at the National Archives for her entire professional life. And she has spent the last 23 years meeting with the same young people that I've been working with. And she said, although it's not a statistic and an anecdote, she is shocked by the number of young people from the very best colleges in the United States of America who come to the National Archives who have never, at one point in their life, read the United States Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. They've never read the Federalist Papers, and they've never heard of them. I was with a group which was almost totally comprised of young men and women from the Ivy League in the White House Fellows Program 2 years ago. And I asked if people in that room would stand if they had read the United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, those four. And I asked if there was anybody in the room who had read all four, if they would stand up. And it was a room of about 125 people. And not one of them stood up. So I called my friend Harvey Mansfield, who has taught at the Harvard School in the Department of Government at Harvard for 4 decades. I said, Harvey, I had several of your students or students from Harvard in the room with me today. And I told him the story I just told you. He said, well, don't be surprised. He said, at Harvard, we do not have a single class in the undergraduate curriculum on the American founding, the American Revolution, the American Civil War. Not one. He then asked me to call another colleague of his who teaches in the Harvard Law School. He said, I want you to ask her whether it is a requirement at any point in 3 years in the Harvard Law School that a graduate has to take a class that requires one reading in the United States Constitution. And so I called her, and she said, of course not. This is at the Harvard Law School. My friends, we are at a perilous moment. And if you're wondering why somebody who has served in public life for 20 years is standing before a group of classical educators, and how it is that government relates to classical education, the answer is this. If we do not propel into our natural national life the boys and the girls who pass through your hallways, if we do not sink into them the absolute necessity of the marriage of Christians who are well educated into our public life, we will end up with a country that we do not recognize. I want to speak as strongly as I can on this point. I am a conservative and a Christian and a Republican, but I am not speaking in this point as a conservative, a Christian, or a Republican. I'm speaking as an American and someone who believes that this is the greatest country in the history of man. Neither my grandparents nor my parents could have ever stood at a podium anywhere in America when they were 45 years of age and said to any group of educators that we may fundamentally lose the natural inheritance and heritage of our country. And I am not a conspiracy theorist, and I am hopefulist from A to Z, because we know that we serve another king and another kingdom, and that we are passing through. And we know, particularly as Lutheran Christians, that there are two kingdoms, and that these kingdoms are naturally in conflict, and that while we know that we are headed to the city of man, that we have duties and responsibilities and obligations, that we're heading to the city of God, that we have duties, responsibilities, and obligations while in the city of man. And we understand that there are no duties to get onto a white horse with a Constitution in one hand and the Holy Bible in the other, and ride up Pennsylvania Avenue thinking that we can Christianize our country and save it for all time. But I would argue as strenuously as possible that increasingly our brothers and sisters in Christ are tending away from the state houses of their states. They are tending away from the federal government, and they are looking askance at a place like Washington and saying, why on earth would I ever want my students or children to be a part of that? And I would argue with the great Martin Luther that cynicism and skepticism can play no part in our faith, because our story and narrative does not end on Good Friday. By the way, in 1804, when Thomas Jefferson was rewriting the Holy Bible and doing lots of fancy editing, you may or may not know that his Bible ends with the sealing of the tomb. That's where it stops. And that sort of pride, unfortunately, accumulated with great capital in the Enlightenment, has spilled over all these years later. I want to say one other thing, if I may. Speaking particularly as somebody who works at Focus on the Family. As the American family goes, so goes America. Joseph Califano said it better than anybody has ever said it. That government cannot love a person, and that the family is the original Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. These little people who come into your classroom and are your charges, they are desperately, even though they don't know it, growing up into a culture that is antithetical to the values that we believe in. They are looking for at least one adult in their life to tell them that there is a certain and better way to live. And the liberal arts provide one of the most remarkable roadmaps in the history of either Western or Eastern civilization. My life has been so much more enriched as a public servant and a man of faith by reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, by reading Dante and Shakespeare, by spending time with Dostoevsky and with Chesterton and Belloc and Lewis. We need to have public servants who are not only Christians but who are classically educated, who understand this tension between Athens and Jerusalem, not as opposing elements, but in a natural conversation that has taken place for 3,000 years and of which they are about to join. Because if we can draw from and evoke these first principles which are immutable over time. And if we can mesh them into our public life, it is remarkable the kind of refreshment and revitalization that will take place in the United States of America. Now, as Lutherans, I have to share something with you, which is one of the most remarkable things that you can possibly imagine. And unfortunately, it's true. I was reading 2 weeks ago in the Washington Post a huge piece, favorably written, about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Martin Luther, and the Reformation. And if you've not seen it, it's easy to find. I'm begging you to take a look. I was shocked. I said to my wife at breakfast on Saturday morning, I said, Jenny, I've just read a piece on the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the Reformation of Martin Luther, which is favorable in the Washington Post. Or as we called it at our house, the Washington Compost. And I promise you, she gave me the best line ever. She said, surely you jest. The line in this story, however, that I'm going to share with you is a remarkable summation of what I'm trying very inadequately to describe to you. The reporter was walking down the street in front of the great church in Wittenberg. The reporter was trying to underscore to the reader that Wittenberg is now not only the most unchurched city in all of Germany, but it is the most and anti-Christian. And the reporter was walking down the street and asked a man on the street, "Sir, do you know who Christ is?" And his response was, "No, I don't. Was he a friend of Martin Luther's?" This is where we are at, my friends. Another snapshot for you. Not from the Jerusalem side, which I've just given you, but from the Athens side. Our boys are 13 and 11, Timmy and Paul. The loves of my life, as I call them. And we go once a month to one of the 15 Smithsonian institutions just to sort of take a look at things. A few weeks ago, I took them to the National Gallery of Art, and I took them to the Rembrandt Room. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest rooms in the United States of America. And about 3 times a year, I praise God for the Mellon family. As we were standing in front of the very famous portrait of St. Paul, I heard a mother next to us say, I heard a daughter next to her mother say to her mother, "Who was St. Paul?" Who was St. Paul? Who was Christ? My friends, it is very tempting to stand at this podium and to say to you that we are a nation that is at war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. That we are facing the greatest financial challenge to our country since the 1930s. That we are in the midst of a major debate on the future of energy in the United States of America. That next week we will begin the biggest debate on health care reform. That we are preparing for a galactically important Supreme Court nomination. And that somehow a mixture of all these things are the biggest threats or the biggest concerns facing our country. But I promise you, they do not hold a candle to the greatest threat that is facing the United States of America. It is a combination of the dictatorship of relativism combined with a lethal multiculturalism. And when you put that together in a toxic brew, do you know what you get? You get among the rising generation of young people a historic and cultural illiteracy that is unsurpassed in American history. And our founders were very clear. And I digress for one moment. Jimmy Madison weighed 100 pounds wet. I think he was 5'3". In his entire lifetime, he never traveled more than 500 miles from his front door. And I would argue that next to the Holy Scripture, there has been no document more influential in the history of man than the United States Constitution, which he drafted. He was a good Episcopalian, low church man by his own definition. But he famously said that the Constitution had been written by the finger of God. And what I'm arguing to you is this: that James Madison believed that you could not have liberty and you could not have freedom if you did not have virtue in the people. In fact, he said the other side of freedom was moral excellence, which he said you could not legislate, and which he believed was firmly ingrained in America. Tocqueville believed the same. When Tocqueville came to America, traveled America as a Frenchman, as a French aristocrat, spent lots of time in American churches and homes and farms, etc. He said the reason that this empire of liberty will go on and on through the ages is because this is a virtuous people. And he said at bottom that that virtue was undergirded by the sense of a Judeo-Christian country. He was speaking about us. Europe, of course, has been drained of the Judeo-Christian tradition, to the point where you can be in the town of the founder of the Reformation and not know who Christ is. You can be a young woman going to St. Albans School, $28,000 per year, one of the most expensive elite schools in America. Be with your mother at the National Gallery of Art, standing before a Rembrandt painting, never having heard of St. Paul. I understand, coming from Washington, D.C., that anecdotes do not add up to statistics. But you know it's true, and you see it in your schools and your parishes and the towns and cities from which you and I come. And what happens, my friends, if we end up with a leadership class in the political classes of America, the very heights of secular power? What happens someday if we end up with senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices, and a president who does not know any of these things? What happens? My last comment. President Obama recently traveled to Turkey, the one country that is Muslim and wishes to join the European Union. And he went to Turkey, and he said that while the United States had a significant Christian population, that we should not be understood as a Judeo-Christian country. And he further said that the United States was in fact a Muslim country, one of the largest, he said, in the world. None of the above is the case. He did go on to say that we were a country that was connected and weaved together by values. But of course, he didn't say where the values come from. And I want to stress as possibly, as strongly as I can, that this is not a criticism of President Barack Obama. It is a comment on where we are at in 2009, not in government, but in culture. So, short of moralizing and lecturing, I would argue as strongly as I can that the need for young people in public life who are committed Christians has never been stronger. All of those young people who come to you, as all thoughtful young people do, who are trying to make sense of it all. Who is God? What is He about? What is my role in all of this? What am I supposed to do with my life? I pray earnestly that you would encourage every one of those young people to think about spending part of their life in public service. Because in Washington, there are no permanent victories and there are no permanent defeats. In Washington, personnel is policy. It is very important that we surround the princes of this world with the power and the truth and the strength of the Holy Gospel. That as Christians, we do not separate or self-segregate ourselves from our public national life, but that we, in the best sense, mesh into this empire of liberty. And that we bring all of the values, the salt and the light, that are our birthright and that are our daily gifts, that we bring them into this swirl of public policy for the betterment of other people. I am happy to say that I'm not going to speak on and on, but I'll stop there and I will happily answer or duck a few questions. Thank you all very much. And someone has to be brave enough to go first.
Plenty of time for it.
Yes, on any subject. Yes, sir.
I went to an LSF retreat one weekend a few years back, and a professor from Concordia, St. Paul, was giving a discursus on how the Christian right had conflated the two kingdoms. She was using Luther's writing on the civil authority and to what extent should the Christian obey, and her read of the doctrine of the two kingdoms advocate for Christians pulling out of public life in exactly the way that you're speaking against.
Yes, sir.
And she used the memorials that were set up in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, as an example of this terrible tendency to have like a knee-jerk patriotism and mixing Christianity with that. I didn't really appreciate how she was influencing those college kids to essentially disengage from politics. And it really sounded very much like she was trying to teach the doctrine of the two kingdoms in a way that really advocates for a kind of a leftist agenda, left-wing politics. Can you piggyback on that?
I will.
Have you encountered that mentality and that
Absolutely.
misreading of?
Most definitely. Yes.
Okay.
Let me answer your question first in demographics related to elected politics, and then to the cultural question. 43% of all people who voted for John McCain and Sarah Palin are self-identified evangelical Christians. That's gigantic. In 2000 and in 2004, George W. Bush got about 75% of all evangelical votes. About 25% went to John Kerry and Al Gore. And of course, I was responsible for that segment of the campaign. This is what's crucial. I preoccupied myself with the demographic 18 to 25 for all the reasons we've been talking about. By more than 2 to 1, evangelicals 18 to 25 through 2 major presidential elections voted for Bush-Cheney. John McCain and Sarah Palin received about 75% of the evangelical vote, about the same percentage as George W. Bush did. However, In that demographic of 18 to 25, they lost evangelical vote, young evangelical votes by almost 3 to 1. Okay. That's huge. That in politics is an earthquake. I attribute this, to go to the heart of the question you're asking me, to a combination of factors. The biggest one of which is that young evangelicals are more educated and affluent now than at any time since evangelicals en masse came back into American politics. Most self-identified evangelicals remained separated from politics until the late 1970s. We forget that. When you look, and I have, when you look at the vote totals demographically of who voted and who did not, beginning in the 19-teens, I'm speaking specifically of the 20th century, evangelicals overwhelmingly were taught in their churches and schools, stay out of politics. Don't get your hands dirty. Compromise is a dirty word. I'm very happy to say Lutherans have never, ever, from the founding of what we think of as formal Lutheranism, have never taken that view. We have always viewed ourselves as in, but not of the world, that we had public duties and responsibilities, and we were to be a part of our national life. I cringe with you when I hear any professor or any speaker urging young people to self-segregate themselves from our public life. In my view, that is not only unbiblical, it is very strongly outside of our catechesis as believing, practicing, confessional Lutherans. In fact, Luther taught just the opposite. And beyond teaching the opposite, he lived the opposite. You know what Luther did? He changed the world by his ideas. Ideas have consequences. And bad ideas, which infiltrate themselves into philosophy, theology, literature, math, and science, they have consequences too. Bad ideas have bad consequences. And so my view, and I'm assuming by the premise of your question, your view, is that Dr. Johnson was right. Patriotism is the last vestige of a scoundrel. But that's cheap patriotism in the same way that Bonhoeffer told us that that's cheap grace. We are to be in it. We're not to be of it. And we are to be salt and light. And we are to be exactly what St. Paul was when he went to Athens. When St. Paul, the first great public intellectual in our Christian faith, when he went to Athens, do you remember what he did? He went first to the marketplaces, and he shared the good news. The marketplace. This was St. Paul, who was taught by Gamaliel, one of the greatest Greek teachers of, Paul, a Roman citizen. He then went to the synagogues, and he taught the great secular, we would say, scholars of his time, and argued and debated with them in the greatest of the Greek traditions, evidence-based reasoning. And then he goes to the very place where Socrates was tried on the question of truth. He stands at the Areopagus, and he says, "You say this, but it's true. The Greek understanding is that this is really a podium." But he talks about Christ, who is truth personified. I mean, these are fighting words. He engaged with that was the Harvard Yard of ancient Greece. But Paul didn't segregate himself. He took his faith fully into the middle of it, the marketplace, the synagogues, the place where intellectuals gathered. And he did it winsomely and civilly and diplomatically, but unapologetically. That's what we're to do. Yes, sir.
Two questions. The highest, the highest Lutheran place of position in Canada, are you aware of who that might be? Yes, sir.
In any cabinet? Yes, sir, I am. My very dear friend Ed Meese, who was Attorney General of the United States of America. He is a Cradle, Missouri Synod Lutheran. He was Ronald Reagan's Attorney General. He was Ronald Reagan's most important counselor chief of staff to Reagan when Reagan was governor of California. Reagan famously was asked, if you were in a crisis, who is the one person you would call? And he said, Ed Meese. Also, the late Chief Justice of the United States of America, William Rehnquist, was a practicing, believing Lutheran Christian. Yes. And of course, in the American Revolution, I don't know if there's anyone here from Pennsylvania. Sorry? Yes, you know the Muhlenberg brothers. Absolutely central to our founding. Yes, for actually 3 generations.
And then the second question, of those Lutherans that were there when you were able to be in Washington in the cabinet, did any of those Lutheran professors or state that they went to Lutheran grade school?
That's an excellent question. I have talked to a number of members of Congress who are Lutheran, and I'm certain that there are a number of them who did. Anybody here from Minnesota? Michelle Bachman, I think, she's Wisconsin Synod. Great regard for the Missouri Synod. Yes.
Our current representative from Wyoming.
Yes, right. Exactly. Yes, right. Exactly. Right. So now, may I sort of bridge off on that comment for a minute? May I tell you the bane of American Lutheranism? We're very good followers. With a name like Goeglein, I know that in Germany, efficiency is raised to a virtue, but I'm talking to the virtue people, and efficiency is not a virtue. We need to teach our young people that it's good to do your duty. That's wonderful. But when I talk, and I have talked to thousands of them, to young Lutherans, and I say, you could be the governor. You can be me. Our Lutheran subculture ingrains hierarchy, continuity, stability, order, tradition, custom. Wonderful. We also need to teach our young people, and I hope I'm speaking to the right room, that you not only can be, you have a duty to be the leader. And we need to get rid of this part of our subculture that doesn't necessarily teach otherwise, but it promulgates, a certain continuity that derives from our faith. Luther, broke that mold in 1,000 ways.
Classical education is education for leadership.
Absolutely right. We are educating for leadership. Absolutely right. That's right. For Christ and His kingdom.
A follow-up on that comment. Years
Yes.
ago, I was told that the Missouri Synod was extremely overrepresented in the United States military, but extremely underrepresented in elected positions, school board.
Yeah, my friend, yes, the answer is you're right, and you're confirming exactly what I'm saying. I'm telling you, Missouri Synod, in our church, in our parish in Alexandria, I've been a member and a deacon there for 20 years. Every chaplain who is Lutheran comes to our church. We have more. It's absolutely terrific. We have more soldier, more military. It's absolutely wonderful. The worst part is in the military, you move every 2 or 3 years, so you get to love these people and their kids, and then they're gone. That is absolutely the case. But to go back to the question here, on the question of the congressman, we are a synod of about 2.5 or 3 million people. That's big. We're the last leaf on the main, the last sort of orthodox on the main line. Someone has to be the last leaf on the tree. But for 3 million people, you would think, over against the Episcopalians, who are 1,200,000, 1,300,000, that percentage-wise, in a body of 535 people, we have a lot of Lutherans. The last time I checked, I think we have between 5 and 7 members of the House, and no members of the Senate. We used to have 1, I think. Conrad Burns. Right. Sorry? Paul Simon was, yes. I got to know him very well. Yes, indeed. He was not a Missouri Synod Lutheran. He began that way, but he and his wife were very simpatico with, which is neither here nor there, but right. His parents were, as you know, missionaries. Yes. Paul Simon was a great man. In my view, he was wrong on many things, and I'm sure he felt the same about me. But we love one another as brothers in Christ.
You started to comment on the turnaround in evangelical vote from 2-1 for Bush and 3-1 for Obama.
Among the demographic 18 to 25.
You gave a reason of influence. Did you have more explanations for why?
Yes, I do. There is an ongoing project to target elite evangelicals in America by the left wing. And it's led by a man called Jim Wallace and Sojourners. They're very, very influential. And the way that they have done it is they've taken the Christian concept of social justice and they've attenuated it so that it is connected into global warming, HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and Africa generally. I've been marching for 20 years in the pro-life march in Washington. This is my 20th year. It was in January. And I always spend the day there, and I talk to bushel baskets full of young people. Well, this year, there were hundreds of young people who came to be a part of that march, who came for the Obama inauguration and stayed for the pro-life march. And I would ask, do you see any disconnect between his... And no, I mean, hear me out. This is... I mean, I know, I like a good laugh, but I'm saying, this is very serious. They see no disconnect between the abortion issue and a vote for somebody who is the most pro-abortion president in American history. And when you ask these young people why, do you know what they say? Abortion is important. The family is important. Global warming is important. HIV/AIDS is important. Malaria. And their concept of life they see as of a piece, not rooted in one or two issues. By the way, let me share something that's very heartening with you. For the first time in American history, for the first time in a Gallup poll, there are more pro-life Americans than not. The demographic among young people is huge. When you look at the same numbers for young people, 18 to 25, do you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman? By more than 3 to 1, they're against our view. Right. Another way of saying it is that Americans 18 to 25, by a majority, believe that marriage is not defined as between a man and a woman. It can be 2 men or 2 women. And by the way, those numbers are virtually the same among young Christians, self-identified young Christians. Right. I'm going back to the cultural comments I was making a moment ago. Right. Yes.
Just a comment on what you mentioned about Harvard.
Yes.
I mean, they look at the rest of us as just territorial colleges, because Harvard is the elite. They actually teach none of the, in advanced placement American history classes at the high school level, that's still part of the curriculum. Federalist Papers,
yeah, sure.
Read the Constitution.
Yes.
You even touch on de Tocqueville.
Right.
But that is actually being discredited at the same time right now, because they're moving towards more social history instead of actual real Frederick Jackson Turner history.
Right, you bet.
And the International Baccalaureate, which is much more liberal, is now, because universities are not accepting AP classes anymore.
Right, that's right.
That's right. Comment on that?
Yes, I would. First, I want to give you hope on Harvard, if I may.
From the territories here.
If I may. I was at a meeting in New York City a little over a month ago, and I was asked to go to a breakfast called the New Canaan Society, which is comprised of men and women who work for Fortune 200 companies. And I thought, well, this would be a small coffee clash. They meet in Rockefeller Center every Tuesday, and I would say there were approximately 125 people there. At that meeting, I met 2 young men, one who is at Goldman Sachs and one who is at, I think, Morgan Stanley. They're both 23, 24. They are very committed Christians. They are both accepted into the Harvard Business School in the fall, and they already have a list of 35 other men and women who are going to be in the first Harvard business class together. They already are all connected by Facebook and MySpace, and they've already formed their first weekly Bible study. Okay, that's exciting. Also, the Lutheran Witness recently had a cover story on 5 young Lutherans who were all Harvard undergraduates. And so I called 2 of the 5. And I'm going to Harvard in November to speak. And they said that there is now a group there of over 150 students who meet every week. Yes. So hope springs eternal.
And they haven't been sent to a deprogramming?
No, they've not been deprogrammed yet. That's right. Right. Now, I want to be more granular in specifically what you're asking. So, not that you have to restate it, but tell me specifically what you're asking.
Well, I'm asking if there's, I mean, it appears to be a conspiracy of some type. I don't know if conspiracy is the right word, but the general trend, I mean, with the national standards in history, it became a joke. Those were introduced about 15 years ago, and it's just gotten worse and worse. I mean, social history has taken over.
Right, I agree with you.
It's taken over at the university level, and really the last bastion, it's hard to say, was that good high school teachers were actually still teaching real American history, because they weren't getting it in colleges, because the kids would come home and talk to me about it and say, boy, he doesn't even mention what you mentioned. He said, but he wants to know who taught me that.
Right, right. Yeah, I will comment upon that. Bruce Cole is a professor emeritus of the fine arts at Indiana University in Bloomington, and is the immediate past chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dana Gioia is a very famous American poet. I could go on and on with his sort of background. He was the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts in the last 8 years, and they collaborated over time, and they did a study with the ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which you all should know about if you don't. ISI in Wilmington, Delaware. They are extraordinary in every single way. And they commissioned a study exactly on this point. What do students know? And the numbers, to go back to my point about cultural and historical literacy, are shocking. But they are particularly shocking at those colleges that are identified as the best 100 in America. In fact, they take a look online. I mean, you'll see what I'm talking about, because they list exactly what's taught in the undergraduate curriculums, and they ask them basic questions. Who was the first president of the United States? Who were the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers? I mean, things like this. The highest grade, I think, was Columbia, and it was 51%. It was so it confirms exactly what you're saying. My history teacher was Bob Farrell. He was one of the most famous diplomatic historians in America. He's 86 years old. He is a Truman-era Cold War Democrat. And he said that in his 50-plus years of teaching, that he felt that the state of what you're referring to, the sort of social versus typical military or diplomatic history, was the worst ever in his lifetime. And that his teacher at Harvard, Sam Beal, would have been absolutely shocked. Yeah, so I think you're more than absolutely right. Right. And if I can say, it's not just educating for things you need to know, the sort of E.D. Hirsch view. It's also educating for virtue. And so what we have ended up with is not only illiterate and innumerate young people, we've also ended up with young people who are very confused about whether they're male or female, about what constitutes gender. This is a very central part, as you all know, of what we're facing. A snapshot. We now have a budget in the United States Department of Education budget. We have now increased that by $100 billion over 5 years. $100 billion over 5 years. And in Washington, they are going to close the only school choice program we have. And one of the principal reasons they're arguing against it is because it has the sort of standards that you're talking about, which they say are antiquated. Yes? Wow. Right. You bet. Yes, sir.
You talked about in a couple of years where we may not have the Constitution anymore. I won't argue that we're already at that point. You're obviously talking about something more, like literally. What's the process now?
My friend, if no one ever reads the gospel, if we end up with a culture that doesn't know the sort of, forget for a moment that you're a Christian. But going back to your point that there's certain things that you have to know to be a good citizen and to sort of live in a distinctively Western culture. If you don't know who St. Paul is, or Christ, or Rembrandt, if you have no idea what people say when you talk about the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment, or who's James Madison, or why do I need to know him anyway? I'm just not sure when you put that together what you have. I think what you have is you have sort of a relativistic war on a particular country. Yeah. I mean, in America, we've had two revolutions. We've had the American Revolution, and we've had the sexual revolution. Okay? And the large march through the institutions, which began in the 60s, of course, has almost obliterated the American family, to the point where marriage increasingly is for affluent and educated people. Until relatively recently, whether you were a Christian or Jew or not, it was considered a taboo to have children before marriage. Now that, as we all know, is a Christian principle. It didn't just sort of arrive from sort of German, ancient Nordic, pagan theology. It just didn't. Now it is perfectly acceptable in the working and middle classes to have children before marriage, if a marriage ever formed. That's new. That's new. Something to remember. Rich white liberals and rich white conservatives, by and large, don't get divorced. I mean, they do, but the divorce numbers are comparatively very low. And they don't either for theological reasons, but mostly for pragmatic reasons. They understand it's expensive, that's true, but quite apart from our theology. I mean, it's a sort of Machiavellian pragmatic quotient. They understand that a commitment over time is better for biological children. I mean, that's just a fact. Yeah. However, in the culture in which we are living, it's a culture that does not emphasize human dignity or human worth. In fact, on MySpace and YouTube and I'm trying to think, Twittering, you can be multiple people. No, but I'm very serious about that. It's a life behind screens. You can go 24 hours and not really interact with another human being, but you feel that you've reacted with 500. I mean, in this generation, it becomes an ontological question, right? And so, if we are not communicating linguistically, in all the ways that you do, you lose this sense of personal relationship, which has been so central to the success of classical education. I mean, every teacher knows that when you go into a classroom and shut the door, something important happens there between teacher and student that you can't quite explain. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but I've sat in enough classes where I know that that's the case. And it's almost magical what happens, It's just not the same when it's distance learning. But this whole idea of the tutorial, of this sort of, you can mostly put it in a shoebox and take it to the Smithsonian because that era increasingly is gone with the wind. I'm also, and I know you are, very concerned about the future of parochial education. It's going away. And it's going away not because people got up one day and said, it's a cultural question. And it relates directly to government and what government feels that it should or should not do. And when you have what we have, which is a monopoly in the public schools, it has enormous ramifications for Christians in the way that we maneuver. Did you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'm trying to formulate it.
Good.
Two things are really hard for me to reason for here. And one is reflected in the 18 to 25-year-old demographic voting Democrat.
Right.
When I would talk with them, their basic response was, yes, I'm opposed to abortion. And the Republicans dominated Congress
Uh-huh.
as presidencies for 20 years. And my sense was that they don't see any point in voting for Republicans because they didn't do anything. And so what actually, forgive me,
No, please. No, I'm thrilled that you're asking it. I think it's a good question. I'm not being rude to you. I'm glad to hear. No, but it's not. I have very good ears, but there's the.
right, there's a growing concern, I think. among
Yes.
Christians that got into politics, they elected people.
The disillusion question.
Yes.
Yeah, may I address
Yes.
that? May I address that?
Sure.
Okay. Here's what you should tell your students. again, to argue from the specific to the general. George W. Bush was president for 8 years and was the most pro-life president in American history. He signed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. He signed the bill that banned partial birth abortion, which Bill Clinton had signed twice when it was made officially legal. We fought that in 4 of the federal circuits and lost in all of them. As you know, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The president nominated as our Chief Justice John Roberts, who is pro-life, and has already ruled in 2 cases that are pro-life. He nominated Samuel Alito to an Associate Justice who is pro-life and has ruled in those 2 same cases. And he nominated and confirmed 35% of all sitting federal judges. The president is the person who wrote the conscience protection in the HHS, which is now being banned. He signed a bill in opposition to any form of cloning. He created the Bioethics Council, which have kept us from the unethical kind of stem cell research. That's huge. Elections have consequences. With the exception of the Supreme Court, which are lifetime appointments, of the 7 policies or executive orders that I just mentioned, they have already all been vitiated in the new presidency. Every single one of them. In other words, if you are a healthcare, if you are a doctor or a healthcare provider, beginning in 2010, January of 2010, you will have no conscience protections. None whatsoever. You can legally lose your job if you participate in that which you think is most morally offensive to you regarding any of the life questions. We're on the fast track to human cloning. In fact, I would say that something along the line in the states of $7 billion is already being spent in federal funding for unethical stem cell research. And we are moving in the sort of nanotechnology role of biotech, which is a booming industry, and which will have enormous ramifications for the questions of human dignity. So to young people who say that politics don't matter or feel disillusioned, I promise you that elections do matter, and that while Roe v. Wade has not been overturned, I would argue that we are on the trajectory for Roe being overturned if there is one more pro-life justice who is confirmed. I think what will happen is that Doe v. Bolton will be the first decision that will be visited, and then Roe v. Wade. And I think it will be overturned, but then it will immediately go back to the states. And then at that point, we will probably have at least 25 states that would legalize abortion. Anybody from Kansas? The Tiller case is a very good example. Under the Bush administration, I don't know if you know who George Tiller is. He is one of 3 abortionists in the country who do partial birth abortions. And he was murdered recently. If the courts had upheld the ban on partial birth abortion, there would have been no more partial birth abortion. But Americans don't understand that since 1973, we've had 53 million abortions in America. And that's about 1,100 partial birth abortions every year, which is to say children who are dismantled in vitro who are at least 9 months of age. But Americans aren't aware of it. Many Americans are not aware of this. Many Americans who are aware that abortion is legal think it's only illegal in the first trimester. So the most we can do is, from evidence, argue back to our young people that it does matter, that there's no political party that will ever be perfect, and that because the human condition is completely fallen and sinful, that we can never put our faith in princes. But that it's important to be engaged in public policy. You know, T.S. Eliot famously said, there are no lost causes because there are no gain causes. It's a profoundly Christian viewpoint of public life. He said we argue in battle, not that we will have victories in this life, but that our efforts may provide the portal for victory for the generation that comes after us.
So one more comment on your constitutional question. The red states in particular, I think sometimes are their own worst enemy constitutionally, because the only amendment they care about is the second. I mean, they look at the 5th and the 4th and the 1st as somehow evil and liberal, but they're preserved the right to bear arms to the death. And I wrote an op-ed piece in our local paper about that you guys are gung-ho on guns, but you see that the Second Amendment is pretty well worthless without the First.
Or without the others.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, they're all codependent.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And of a piece. You know, it's interesting to go back to the question of young people. When you talk to young people who are really interested in politics, you have two strains, libertarians and evangelicals. And the libertarians fit right into the mold that you're talking about. They are disgusted with religion. They believe that there should be no discussion of faith in public life whatsoever. But when they define themselves as conservatives. When in fact they're not conservatives, they're libertarians. And they think that if we can just get the calculus right of low taxes and less regulation and free reign in guns and all this, then we'll get it right in America.
Ron Paul was real popular in my town.
I don't doubt it. But as Christians, it's not that liberals or conservatives or libertarians. It's that Christ needs to be at the center. And the Christian ethos grows from there. Not that we Christianize America. In fact, Martin Luther taught us that theocracy is anathema. That's not what we want. We expressly do not want a theocracy. But we want to promulgate the virtue that undergirds good public policy and a healthy, revitalized public life.
Ever since Rules for Radicals, I think the left has been highly organized and working their revolution from within the system. And now we're really bearing the fruit of that. What do we need to do over the next 30 years to counteract what they did the last 30 years?
The power of Marx, Freud, and Darwin is never to be underestimated. Those ideas are as vivid and as powerful as they've ever been. And as a secular culture has increasingly sought to replace the Judeo-Christian culture in America, it is those ideas that have filled the vacuum. Right. So it's not hand-to-hand combat, because the Christological view can never be that. We're not looking for utopia, and we're not looking for building heaven on earth. And we understand that paradise lost and paradise regained is real, but that it does not exist this side of eternity. So, but the 1960s were not about overtaking conservative institutions and making them liberal. It was about overtaking liberal institutions in large measure and making them radical. And now the children and grandchildren of that generation are in great power, positions of power and influence. I don't think power and influence is the same. It's very different. Those are very different realms. But radicals control the federal bureaucracy, the better museums and symphonies, the media and Hollywood, the better universities and public schools, the foundations, and in many of the churches, yes. The main line is mostly a shadow of itself. It doesn't really exist. I mean, Will Burton said, orthodoxy is my doxy, and heterodoxy is another man's doxy. And Will Burton was right. But there are two doxies. Chesterton saw this very clearly. C.S. Lewis saw it very clearly. Luther saw it presciently. Right? And it's hard to believe that it's from Germany that he came.
Let's get one more in
Yes.
here. Andrew?
Just thinking about what Jim said, it seems to me there's a strategic issue in that let's call us conservative. We don't have a principle of unity after the Soviet Union fell. And the Democrats and liberals do have that principle of unity. It seems to me that part of our division is that some of us are Christians and some of us are not. we're all trying to go back to some certain principles without knowing exactly why. The thing that Darwin, Freud, and Marx all root their philosophy is a rejection of nature. And so we've been focusing on, we talk about the law of nature and the nature of God.
Right.
We've been spending a lot of time on nature of God.
Yep.
It seems to me that if we're going to be harmonized, we have to go back to the law of nature.
I'll be internalizing everything that was said here, for the next 100 years. Two things, if I may. As a conservative, as a Lutheran, I do not want to go back to the 1940s. You know what I want to go back to? To a time of shared moral assumptions, regardless of your party. That the church is central, that the family is central, that friendship is central, that neighborhood is central, that community and calling go together, that you have a moral obligation to help orphans and widows and prisoners and strangers, that putting other people ahead of yourself is really important. And that it's a moral choice, regardless of your party. So I think that's really important. But so I don't think the way forward is the way back. I don't. I also think that I'd rather live in the real world and not the evolutionary. We took our 11-year-old for his birthday and his friends to King's Dominion last Saturday, an amusement park near Washington. I've never seen so many human beings who were ringed and tattooed. That's the culture in which we live. Far be it for me to look for the splinter in their eyes, over against the log that's in my own. We have to love our country. We have to work overtime to sort of raise the sort of quotient of excellence that we all want. This is another way to say it. We are all in the same big battle, but we are just in different foxholes, because we have the same big vocation, but we have specific vocations. But we are working with a rising generation of young people where the linguistics and the semiotics and the optics are very different from the generation that was born in 1964. And so we have to go where they're at and meet them there and bring them along the lines of these first principles. But we have to come alongside them and love them and nourish them and teach them to love the things that we love, and to discern the moral quotient in this question, and Jesus Christ is the one who still in the Sermon on the Mount preached the greatest sermon in the history of man, and it's all there, but it's one thing, beginning with yours truly, it's one thing to read it, it's another thing to live it. But I think as far as a catechesis, we can't do better than that. And I think young people are hungry for that. And from that should, for all of us, grow this remarkable sense of hope. And I, for one, am extremely, extremely hopeful because of the people like the men and women in this room. So if the question is, why did I come to Missouri, that's the answer. God bless you. God bless you.